Chapter 22. As the team began to disperse from the fencing room, Miss Thornhill, who had been lingering near the door, froze at the sound of Adele's voice. She had been hoping to eavesdrop without drawing attention, but it seemed the Nevermore crew wasn't as oblivious as she had assumed. Adele's sharp eyes flicked to the door, where Miss Thornhill was half hidden behind a pillar. In an instant, Adele snapped her fingers twice, an unmistakable signal to the Nightshade Society. "Keep an eye on her," Adele muttered under her breath, her tone low but commanding. The rest of the team exchanged knowing glances, and Ajax, Xavier, Bianca, Pugsley, and Yoko silently stepped into action. Meanwhile, Wednesday's piercing gaze followed Miss Thornhill as she quickly exited the room, her steps quick and calculated. Adele turned to Wednesday, her smirk widening. "Wednesday, go have a date with Tyler, will you?" Wednesday raised an eyebrow, not even hiding her skepticism. "Why?" "Because I said so." Adele's voice was sharp, a slight edge to it that hinted at something more beneath the surface. With a sigh, Wednesday nodded, her suspicion about Miss Thornhill only growing stronger. She had been wary of the older woman for days, especially since Miss Thornhill had been getting unnervingly close to Tyler, and now Adele's command only confirmed her gut feeling. Turning on her heel, Wednesday headed out of the room, her thoughts racing. There was more to this than just Miss Thornhill's presence, something told her the stakes were higher than ever. Miss Thornhill walked into Sheriff Donovan Galvin's office, her heels clicking sharply on the wooden floor. She'd been plotting her next move ever since she'd overheard Adele discussing her strategy in the fencing room. The cunning gleam in her eyes was unmistakable. It was clear that, in her mind, the fight was far from over. After all, the sheriff had been under fire ever since Lucas, the mayor's son, had overdosed in Mexico during spring break. The local gossip had already painted a picture of the sheriff as a negligent, uncaring parent, and Miss Thornhill was sure that exposing the Addams family would help distract from his personal failures. She had hoped the lawsuit against the Addams family would be the perfect ammunition. If the Addams family lost everything in court, maybe that would shift some of the town's disdain away from the sheriff and onto them. She approached Galvin's desk with purpose, and he didn't even look up from his paperwork at. His anger was raw, but the doubts Miss Thornhill had planted earlier kept creeping into his thoughts. "Sheriff," Miss Thornhill started, her voice sweet but laced with barely concealed urgency, "I have news. There's something you need to know about that court case with the Addams family." Galvin finally looked up, his eyes tired but alert. "What now, Thornhill?" "I've heard what Adele is planning," she said, leaning in slightly, a hint of triumph in her voice. "She's going to publicly humiliate you in court. She's going to expose your failures as a father, turn the whole town against you. I think you should know, in case you didn't realize what you're up against." Galvin's eyes narrowed as he processed her words, but Miss Thornhill didn't stop. "She's going to paint a picture of you as a hypocrite, a negligent father who lets his son travel to a country with a do not travel advisory," she continued, her tone syrupy with false sympathy. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his hand rubbing his chin. Miss Thornhill pressed, her eyes gleaming with glee. "Adele is incredibly smart, Sheriff. And she's been working on this for weeks. I'm sure she's already got everything ready to bring you down. And let's not forget, if she succeeds, your career will be over. And so will your reputation. She's not going to let you get away with this. You'll never look the same again." Galvin let out a long, frustrated sigh. His hands dropped to his desk, and for the first time in a long while, doubt crept in. Miss Thornhill saw the shift in his demeanor, and for a moment, she felt a rush of satisfaction. It was working. She had him right where she wanted him. He was going to file the case, and the Addams family would pay for everything they'd done to him. But what Miss Thornhill didn't realize was that Adele had already anticipated her every move. Flashback. Adele had been 3 steps ahead of Miss Thornhill from the start. The minute she'd heard about the lawsuit, she'd known it wouldn't be long before the town's most meddlesome resident would try to use it to her advantage. So, she'd taken action long before Thornhill could get any traction. Adele had called Sheriff Galvin herself. The conversation had been brief, but precise. She'd made it clear that if the sheriff pursued the case, she'd expose every flaw in his actions, from his hypocritical stance on Tyler's trip to his unwillingness to face the truth about how he was perfectly willing to let Tyler go to Mexico, a country under a do-not-travel advisory from the State Department, instead of a supervised trip to England. Not to mention the mayor's son Lucas. She reminded him that the entire town was already talking about Lucas's overdose in Mexico. And if that wasn't enough, she subtly hinted that she had even more information that could completely unravel him in a courtroom. It had been a brilliant move on Adele's part. She knew that Sheriff Galvin's pride would never allow him to go up against her in court. She'd given him an ultimatum without him even realizing it. It was a quiet threat, but one that had landed with surgical precision. Present. Back in Galvin's office, the tension between him and Miss Thornhill was palpable. He sat there, his fingers drumming on the desk, eyes glazed as he mulled over everything Thornhill had just said. "I'm going to drop the case," he said suddenly, surprising both Miss Thornhill and himself. His voice was firm, but there was a weight to it that spoke volumes. "What?" Miss Thornhill gasped, taken aback. "You can't be serious. After everything? You're going to just let them get away with it?" Galvin shook his head, his expression hardening. "It's not worth it. I can't win this case. Not with Adele pulling the strings behind the scenes." Miss Thornhill's face twisted in disbelief. "But you can't let them win. They'll just walk away from this without consequences. You have to fight them." He looked up at her, his eyes cold. "You don't get it, do you? If I keep this lawsuit going, I'll look like a fool. I'll be torn apart in the press, and everyone will know it was just a personal vendetta against the Addams family. No one will believe that it was about protecting my son anymore. It'll just make me look petty and spiteful." Miss Thornhill's heart dropped as the full weight of what was happening hit her. "You're dropping it? You're really backing down?" Galvin gave a sharp nod. "I don't have a choice. I'm not going to lose my career over something that wasn't even worth fighting for. You don't understand, Adele knew exactly how to push me. She knew what strings to pull, and now this whole thing is over before it even began." Miss Thornhill's plan had backfired spectacularly. She had wanted to see the Addams family humiliated, but now, she was the one left with nothing. The sheriff, the man she had hoped would be her ally in this, had already made up his mind. "Goodbye, Miss Thornhill," Galvin said, his voice as cold as ice. "I suggest you find a new cause to champion. This one's over." As the door closed behind her, Miss Thornhill stood frozen in the hallway, her mind racing. Everything she had worked for, everything she thought she could control, had crumbled in an instant. She had underestimated Adele, and now the Addams family was out of her reach. Back in the fencing room, Adele's grin widened when Sheriff Galvin had dropped the case against the Addams family. The plan had worked better than expected. She stretched, feeling the satisfaction of a battle well fought. The tension from the last few weeks melted away as she focused on the next challenge. The case was dead, the sheriff's reputation untarnished, and the Addams family's name remained untarnished. "Looks like we won this one," she said casually, tossing her fencing jacket over her shoulder as she turned toward her team. "Let's go celebrate." As Wednesday and Tyler approached the looming silhouette of the Gates mansion once again, the spring air had a certain eeriness that made the whole situation feel almost familiar. They walked toward the mansion, the overgrown vines clinging to the crumbling stone walls like the last remnants of forgotten memories. Tyler's gaze flicked nervously toward the entrance, the memory of Sheriff Galpin's interruption still fresh in his mind. "Wednesday, are you sure it's right for us to come back here? We got caught last time," Tyler muttered, glancing over at her with a furrowed brow. Wednesday, her coat pulled tight against the cold, gave him a sideways glance. "I doubt Miss Thornhill or anyone will call and say that we're breaking into this place after what happened last time," she replied, her voice cool and confident. The air of defiance in her tone was unmistakable. Tyler wasn't as sure. The last time they'd ventured into this dilapidated house, it had been all fun and games, until it wasn't. The sheriff's unexpected arrival had ended their date before anything more could happen. But as he glanced at Wednesday, her dark eyes gleaming with something close to amusement, he felt the tug of excitement once more. She always knew how to make him feel a little bolder than he probably should. "Fine," he said, his voice laced with a reluctant smile. "But if we end up getting arrested again, I'm blaming you." Wednesday raised an eyebrow. "Fair enough," she said, her lips curling into a knowing smile. "But I doubt it will come to that." As they entered the mansion, the familiar scent of dust and decay filled the air. This place, though haunted with its own eerie atmosphere, felt strangely comforting to Wednesday. It was the perfect place for one of their adventures, though Tyler seemed to disagree. Tyler shivered as the door creaked open, the wind sweeping through the empty hallways. "I really don't get how you can love this place," he said, running his fingers along the cracked walls, his voice lowering in respect for the mansion's unsettling ambience. "I'm not in love with it," Wednesday replied, her eyes scanning the shadows that danced in the corners. "But there's something poetic about it. Everything's decayed, yet it still stands. It's like a metaphor for the way I see the world." Tyler stared at her for a moment, his expression softening as he took in her words. "I should have known you'd find the beauty in something so creepy," he muttered with a smile, following her deeper into the house. They made their way into the grand old living room, the space still hauntingly magnificent despite its decay. Tyler set down a lantern, flickering weakly in the corner of the room, and laid out a blanket in front of the old fireplace. "Dinner and a movie," he said, sounding more confident now. He pulled a picnic basket and started setting up their meal. "What food did you bring?" Wednesday asked, eyeing the dusty remnants of a once grand chandelier above them. "I'm not sure if you want to call it food, but I brought it," Tyler said with a smirk. "Some of your family's recipes. We can make this night less creepy mansion and more romantic night in." He unwrapped a small dish, which had some odd-looking but familiar Addams family delicacies. Wednesday's lips twitched. "You're brave," she said, sitting down cross-legged next to him. She eyed the food with an amused skepticism. "You didn't happen to bring anything edible this time, did you?" Tyler gave her a playful glare. "I'd think by now, you'd appreciate a little culinary experimentation. But fine, I'll take that as a no." He handed her a small flask of something dark and mysterious, but at least this might make it all bearable. Wednesday raised an eyebrow, accepting the flask. "I'll save my judgment for later," she said with a mischievous glint in her eye. "You've never steered me wrong before." "True," Tyler said, smiling as he poured them both a drink, "but this time, you might be surprised. I also brought something special." He reached into his bag and pulled out an old film projector. Wednesday tilted her head, intrigued. "You brought a projector? Here? After last time?" Tyler set it up quickly, pulling a sheet from his bag to act as an impromptu screen. "You'll love it," he promised as he clicked the projector on. It sputtered to life, and as it hummed, he adjusted the focus. The title flashed across the sheet, "A Gothic Escape, Our Trip to England." Wednesday's eyes lit up with curiosity as she leaned back, taking a sip from her flask. "England? What's this?" "I figured we could relive our time with your family," Tyler said with a grin. "All the castles, the towns, the ridiculously fun activities. I mean, where else would we go to witness such a bizarre mix of history and eccentricity?" The film started with clips from their trip, shot in various locations around England, with the iconic Addams family activities taking place in stunning, old castles. There were scenes of horseback riding through misty forests, archery on the grounds of a sprawling estate, and Adele, who appeared as usual, far too enthusiastic, teaching the group how to handle swords in an ancient, stone courtyard. Then came the scenes of fencing competitions, poker games under the flickering candlelight, and hunting trips where the whole family seemed to enjoy more than a little too much. "Is this really how we looked?" Wednesday muttered with a half-smile as she watched a clip of herself expertly dodging a fencing blade, her dark eyes focused and intent. Tyler laughed. Yeah, you've got the whole "I'm only doing this because I'm out of alternatives" look down. He wiggled his eyebrows playfully, earning a slight glare from her. She leaned back, a comfortable silence falling between them as the movie continued. The soundtrack from their trip, filled with haunting melodies and subtle undertones of adventure, played in the background. For the first time in a while, Wednesday found herself letting go of the usual weight on her shoulders, allowing herself to enjoy this simple moment. As the movie wound down, there was a quiet sense of contentment between them. Tyler reached over, his hand brushing hers. "You know, I always thought the Addams family was a little weird," he said, his voice low but sincere. "But after this trip, I get it. It's all about making your own fun, living on your own terms." Wednesday looked at him, her dark eyes softening. "And you fit in just fine, Tyler. Maybe you should consider adopting some Addams family traits." Tyler raised an eyebrow, the corners of his lips twitching up into a grin. "Oh? And what exactly would that entail?" "First thing," Wednesday said, her voice colder, "you stop worrying about getting caught in creepy mansions." She smirked as he laughed, the warmth of the fire flickering across his face. "Fair enough," Tyler replied, his hand finding hers once more. "But next time, no more ghost stories." "I'm not buying it." As they leaned back against the fireplace, the movie screen casting eerie shadows across the room, Wednesday couldn't help but feel a sense of calm settle in her chest. Despite everything that had happened, the chaos, the awkward moments, and the ever-present tension with her family, there was one thing that always remained true: these strange moments with Tyler, in places like the Gates mansion, always felt like home. Miss Thornhill's heels clicked sharply against the cobblestone path as she approached the old, weathered gates of the mansion. The air around her was thick with the scent of damp earth and lingering mystery, Jericho's forgotten history, long abandoned by its residents. The mansion had been a source of local legends, but to her, it was simply a place where she could observe in silence. Tonight, it felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. Her pulse quickened as she pushed open the creaking gates, the rusted hinges groaning under her touch. She had come here for answers, hoping to uncover something, anything, that could give her leverage over the Addams family. She'd been burning with frustration ever since she lost the case. Every thread she had pulled had unraveled, leaving her with nothing but bitter regret. But if there was one thing she could control, it was her need for power, and she had one final card to play. She moved toward the mansion's crumbling facade, her eyes scanning the empty surroundings. The night was still and quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. But then, just as she neared the back entrance, she stopped. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw them. Tyler and Wednesday. They were standing by one of the grand windows, hidden from the main street, the soft glow of moonlight casting shadows across their figures. Tyler's hands were gently cupping Wednesday's face, his thumb grazing her cheek as he leaned in to kiss her. She met him halfway, her lips soft yet insistent, as if they were the only two people who mattered in the world. It was everything Miss Thornhill had been hoping to expose, a picture of young love, yes, but also the intimate bond between them. She had assumed they were still just the reckless, rebellious types, but this was different. Their connection wasn't just something physical. It was deep, palpable, something that Miss Thornhill couldn't tear apart with the few scraps of information she'd gathered. The kiss deepened, and for a moment, the world outside their little bubble seemed to vanish. Tyler's hand slipped to her back, pulling her closer, as Wednesday's fingers danced through his hair, a small sigh escaping her lips. Miss Thornhill felt the sharp sting of jealousy, but also something darker, resentment, anger. The way they fit together, the way they existed in that moment as though they were meant to be, made her sick. Her hands clenched at her sides, the anger rising in her chest like an uncontrollable fire. She could see them now, so completely immersed in each other, in their secret, beautiful world, while she stood there, an outsider, powerless to do anything about it. This wasn't just a kiss, it was a declaration, an act that reinforced everything she'd tried to tear apart. They were untouchable. Her nails bit into her palms as she fought to steady her breath. She knew that if she moved, if she made a sound, they would see her, and the fragile image she had been holding on to, of their innocence, their downfall, would crumble. But Miss Thornhill wasn't ready to give up just yet. She wasn't ready to let this moment slip away without one final chance to ruin them. Her jaw tightened, and her legs almost took a step forward, but then something stopped her. It was their faces, so close, so tender. Tyler looked at Wednesday like she was everything, like she was his world, and Wednesday's eyes. They weren't the cold and calculating. The sound of Miss Thornhill's heels echoed like a steady drumbeat against the cobblestone path as she approached the crumbling gates of the old Gates mansion. The cold night air seemed to press in around her, and the musty scent of decay clung to the mansion's walls like a ghost of the past. It was a place of whispers and rumors, of dark legends and faded memories. And yet, to Miss Thornhill, it had become a perfect vantage point. A place where she could observe, wait, and maybe, just maybe, find something to hold over the Addams family. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. This wasn't just about Tyler. It was about the Addams family. And the mansion. The two of them, using this abandoned, cursed house as a venue for their dates, like it was their private escape. It was maddening. They had no right to treat the place like this, as if it were some romantic getaway. And Tyler, he was a pawn in this twisted game. But it wasn't Tyler she was truly angry at. No, it was Wednesday. Wednesday and her family. The way they had wormed their way into Jericho, into Tyler's life. And now, here she was, powerless to stop it. The Addams family had made their mark on the town in a way Miss Thornhill couldn't ignore. But she wasn't going to stand by and watch them continue to humiliate her. Not again. The scene before her, Tyler and Wednesday in the moonlight, only fueled her frustration. She had already been humiliated once, during that meeting with Adele Addams. And she wasn't about to let it happen again. It had been a tense, explosive meeting that day in the principal's office, one Miss Thornhill would never forget. The room seemed to shrink as Adele Addams' words cut through the tension like a sharp blade. The air was thick with frustration, disbelief, and growing unease. The teachers around the table exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the argument unfolding before them. The tension simmered, threatening to boil over. Like, comment, and subscribe to be notified for updates on this series.